At 17, life had always seemed so predictable. College was the next big step, and I assumed, like anyone in my position, that my parents would help me get there. After all, they'd done it for my brother, so why would this be any different? My parents had always been financially stable, and when I thought about my future, I never imagined that I would have to take on the weight of tuition myself. I had already been accepted into my dream school, and everything seemed lined up perfectly. Yet, there was this nagging feeling inside me. They hadn't said a word about how I'd pay for it. When my brother had gone to business school years earlier, my parents had covered everything. I had always assumed they'd do the same for me, especially when I knew they could afford it. My dad was an engineer, my mom a nurse, stable careers, enough savings. They had paid for my brother's education without hesitation, and I never once thought I'd be treated differently. But then the conversation came. It wasn't them bringing it up first, it was me. I had to ask, had to push for the answers I needed. How was I going to pay for college? The moment I asked, I was hit with the answer I never expected. "We think it's best if you pay for it yourself," they said. "Maybe work through college, or take out loans." Shock! Anger! A rush of emotions flooded through me. This wasn't what I had imagined. I had always assumed they would do for me what they had done for my brother. And yet, here I was, facing the cold reality that I wasn't getting the same treatment. Why? What was the difference? It all started to feel unfair, like a betrayal. So, I asked them outright, why had they paid for my brother but not for me? That's when they dropped the bombshell. My father looked at me with those tired eyes and asked me not to get angry before I knew the full story. The truth, he said, was more complicated than I could have imagined. He began with a story I'd never heard before. One that shook me to my core. My father's uncle, who had been there for him at the start of his career, had fallen gravely ill. Leukemia. He wasn't just any relative. This uncle had been the one to help my father when he was just starting out. But the man had lived a hard life. Decades of gambling, drinking, and toxic relationships had left him with nothing. His own children had cut ties with him long before his diagnosis, abandoning him in his final years. I had never met this uncle, but hearing about his fate, about how he had no one left to care for him, pulled at my heart. It made sense now why my father had stepped in. He owed this man, in a way, for the opportunities he had given him years ago. So my father had been paying for his uncle's treatment out of his own pocket. The medical bills had drained his savings. And it wasn't just the treatment costs. My father had been caring for his uncle for years, watching over him as his health deteriorated. It was hard to hear, but my father's voice never wavered. He apologized and explained that, with everything happening, there just wasn't enough money left for my tuition. He told me he was sorry, that he believed in me, and that I was capable of handling this on my own. I couldn't be mad at him, not after hearing everything. It was a difficult situation, but I could understand. His uncle had helped him when no one else did, and now my dad was returning the favor, even if it meant sacrificing my future for it. I swallowed my frustration, realizing that sometimes life isn't fair. My father wasn't just spending money recklessly. He was saving a life that no one else seemed to care about anymore. I couldn't stay angry at him for that. It was a noble thing to do, even if it meant my own dreams would be delayed. I promised my father that I'd figure it out. If it came down to it, I would take out loans, or maybe work through college. And, despite the sadness in his eyes, he assured me he'd support me in whatever way he could. But there was still tension. My mother hadn't said much during this whole conversation, but I could tell something was off. She kept apologizing to me, more than my father had. She didn't say it outright, but I could feel her regret in the air, as if she too wished things were different. I tried to assure her it was okay, that I understood the situation. After all, at least my dad wasn't spending my college fund on something reckless. He was helping someone who had no one left to turn to. That had to count for something, right? But despite my words, she still looked disturbed. It seemed like this was going to be harder for her to accept than it was for me. As the clock ticked down to the start of college, I found myself scrambling for solutions. It was clear that the money I had set aside for school would barely cover the costs, and despite having interned before, I was running on fumes. Desperation led me to one last-ditch effort, finding a job. But deep down, I knew the truth was inevitable. I'd have to take out a student loan. The thought made my stomach turn. The idea of being in debt for years, paying off a loan without even knowing if I'd land a decent job afterward, was terrifying. It felt like my entire future was being decided by a ticking clock, and I was losing the race. Everything had been weighing on me for weeks, consuming my thoughts, until last week, when I discovered something that shifted everything I thought I knew about my family. It all started with a simple realization. I had uncovered the truth about where my dad's money had been going. Actually, I should say, where it was about to go. And yes, as you might have guessed, it had everything to do with my brother, hence the endless mentions of him. Before I dive into what I discovered, let me set the stage and give you some context about my relationship with him. My brother and I never really grew up as close friends. He's much older than I am, and the age gap made sure we never quite clicked. We weren't enemies, but we were also not what you'd call buddies. There was a certain neutrality in our relationship. My parents, I think, were fine with this. It wasn't inconvenient for them. We didn't play together, but we weren't constantly at each other's throats either, so they never saw a need to step in and fix what wasn't broken. That's how it always was between us. Distant. And honestly, we both seemed okay with that. But something shifted when I hit high school, and he, fresh into his college years, suddenly started acting as though I was his competition. The dynamic changed from neutral to uncomfortable. It wasn't overnight, but I began to feel the strain, especially when he'd return home from one of the best business schools in the state. It wasn't just that he was back, it was how he carried himself. He'd make it clear, without saying a word, that he was better than everyone. But what stung more were the jabs he took at me. At first, they seemed harmless, just playful teasing. But as time went on, it became apparent that these jokes were anything but innocent. They were veiled insults. And if I tried to confront him, he'd brush me off, telling me to lighten up, to stop taking things so seriously. After he started college, it was like a switch flipped. My brother turned into someone unrecognizable, someone I didn't like, someone who enjoyed making me feel small. When he graduated and moved back home, it got worse. The arrogance, the superiority complex, it was all there, but this time, it was relentless. I got into a massive fight with him, and after that, we barely spoke. But even then, he found ways to tear me down without reason. He was 26, and yet he still found satisfaction in putting me down, as if it was the only way to feel better about himself. He was working at a small firm after graduation, but I could see it wasn't a good fit for him. He constantly complained about how dumb his coworkers were, how unworthy they were of sharing the same office space. His frustration wasn't with the work, but with the people. His career stagnation, he claimed, was because of the recession, nothing more, nothing less. But if you ask me, maybe, just maybe, it was his awful attitude that was holding him back. Because, honestly, being an arrogant know-it-all doesn't exactly make for a great teammate or leader. Still, my parents fed into it. They'd sit there at dinner, stroking his ego, assuring him that better opportunities would come his way. Instead of suggesting that he humble himself and earn his way up, they just coddled him, making excuses for his arrogance. It wasn't surprising, he had their full attention, their full support. Meanwhile, I was out here, stuck. I shared with my friends how devastated I was that my parents wouldn't be helping with my tuition, and I was grateful that I did. Otherwise, I never would have found out the truth. I'd never have discovered that, behind my back, they were funding my brother's new business venture. My brother and I don't follow each other on social media. Actually, I blocked him a while ago because I couldn't care less about his life. But a few of my friends do follow him, and when they saw something odd, they made sure I knew about it. A post he put up 1 week ago shook me to my core. It was a family picture, one I was notably absent from. And in the caption, he was thanking my parents for their unwavering support throughout his life. Not only that, but they were also listed as the first investors in the business he was about to start. My friends were quick to point out the glaring discrepancy. If my parents couldn't help me with my tuition, how could they afford to invest in my brother's business? It didn't make sense. Something didn't add up, and they all agreed. I had to know the truth. I was stunned. I had no idea about this business venture, and honestly, I didn't know where to start. Initially, I thought about confronting my parents, but then I realized it was pointless. I knew exactly what they'd do. They'd lie. They'd cover it up. They'd probably even force my brother to take the post down. So, instead of confronting them, I made a decision that I wasn't prepared for. The evening came, and as I packed my things, I knew what I had to do. My parents had shown me that I was on my own. They had their golden child, and it wasn't me. So I left. Quietly, in the night. I didn't make a scene. I didn't say goodbye. I just got in an Uber and went to a friend's house. They had already offered to let me stay for a while, and while I felt weird about it, after all, who wants to take money from a friend's family, it felt better than staying in a house where I wasn't wanted. And my parents? The next morning, when they realized I was gone, they went into full panic mode. They bombarded me with phone calls and texts, begging me to come home, to at least let them know I was okay. But what hurt most wasn't their desperation, it was the audacity of them asking me why I was doing this to them. Why? Because of everything they'd done to me. Because of their actions, and more importantly, their inaction when it came to supporting me. I didn't respond. I forwarded the post from my brother, and left it at that. They could no longer hide the truth. They tried, of course, but the excuses they made were insulting. They said they were trying to protect me by not telling me the truth. They said that if my brother's business succeeded, they'd help me pay off my student loans in the future. As if I'd just buy into their lies. I'd rather struggle on my own than live a lie with them. So, that's where things stand now. I'm no longer under their roof, no longer dependent on their approval. But the wound they left me with? It's still fresh. I had to shift my perspective. I needed to see this as an investment, not a sacrifice. But honestly, the money wasn't even my biggest issue. What really stung, what truly broke me, was the realization that they were willing to gamble on my brother's future but completely overlooked mine. They were ready to fund an entire business venture for him, yet sending me to college? That wasn't worth their time or money. They told me they didn't have enough funds to help me. It was a lie. A cruel one. They had the money. They just chose not to spend it on me. That hurt more than I can express. I didn't hold back. I told them I couldn't come back. I couldn't stay with people who treated me like this, like I didn't matter. The idea of living in that house, surrounded by people who clearly didn't care for me, felt unbearable. I would have been nothing more than a burden to them, and I couldn't do that. I had to leave. The next part? That's where it all exploded. My mother? She was caught in the middle. She was shaken by everything I said, more so than my father, it seemed. She didn't just sit there quietly. No, she told me everything, how this whole thing wasn't her idea. She never agreed with it. She didn't even want to go along with it, but my father insisted. And so, she went with the flow. She regretted it. She had been too deep in this mess to back out. For days, she tried to reach me. She called, texted, apologized over and over. She was sorry, she said. Sorry for the pain, sorry for not standing up to him sooner. But the truth, the real truth, was that she was scared. Scared she might lose me. She said she would help me with the money, whatever it took, just that I needed to come back to her. But I couldn't. Not yet. My heart was still broken. I couldn't just forgive and forget, not when the betrayal stung so deeply. I took my time. Too much time, maybe. And that was the tipping point. That's when everything came crashing down for my father. Not that I felt bad about it. He deserved it. All of it. He masterminded the lies, the decisions that led to this, and he thought he could get away with it. But I wasn't going to let him. It didn't take long for things to spiral. My mother, frustrated and heartbroken, blamed my father entirely. And I agreed with her. She told him, leave me alone, or she was done. She was ready to walk away. Their arguments went on for days, and I couldn't understand it. My father, somehow, was now blaming me. Me? As if I was the one who'd ruined everything. How could he? I wasn't the one who lied. I wasn't the one who made all those decisions behind my back. He had done all of this to me. But the truth still stung. The longer I stayed away from them, the worse it got between them. My mother blamed him, he blamed me, and the tension was unbearable. I knew my father wanted me back home. He was convinced I'd punished them enough. But it wasn't about punishment for me. It was about healing. I needed space. I wasn't ready to forgive them yet. They had to know that what they did was wrong, and it wasn't something I could get over in a week. 1 week wasn't enough to fix this. Not even close. I wasn't going back just because my father needed me to fix his marriage. Where was he when I needed him? Where was he when I was hurt the most? I wasn't going to save him now. But I still felt guilty. There was this nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was responsible for their crumbling marriage. Could I really stay away and risk losing them both? Could I just walk away and never look back? It was a heavy burden to carry. Days passed. I took my time, but eventually, I knew I couldn't stay away forever. I finally reached out to my mother. I didn't know how I felt about my father, but I couldn't ignore her anymore. She was trying. She was genuinely sorry. Her texts started changing. They weren't just apologies anymore. Now, she was telling me she missed me. She regretted everything, every decision that led to this. She wasn't just sorry, she wanted me back. She even told me she would no longer support my brother's business. All of that money? It was going to go towards my college tuition. She promised me that. She was going to make sure I didn't have to worry about anything. And I could see it in her words, in her actions. She wasn't lying anymore. She was ready to make things right. I had mixed feelings, sure. But she was my mother. And she was trying. It was the least I could do to give her another chance. I didn't know what I was going to say to my father, though. He was a different story altogether. The day I returned home, it wasn't like I expected. My father didn't speak a word to me. He just stood there, grumpy, like he didn't care. But my mother? She hugged me, cried, apologized. She was so relieved to have me back. The tension between her and my father? It was palpable. They weren't even speaking anymore. It was clear they were falling apart. My brother? He wasn't happy either. He was furious that my mother wasn't going to fund his business anymore. He'd have to find other investors, and it would delay everything. But my mother was resolute. She wasn't going to make the same mistake again. As for me, I didn't care. I didn't care about my father or my brother. I had my mother back, and that was all I needed. She didn't have a lot of money to spare. My father made more than she did, but she promised me she'd do whatever it took to make sure I didn't have to worry about tuition. She even talked about asking her parents for help if she needed it. I was finally going to be okay. It wasn't easy, leaving my friend and his family. They were sad to see me go, but they were happy that I was finally getting the support I needed. I would never be able to thank them enough. And now, I'm finally in college. Things are good with my mother. As for my father and brother, they're not in the picture right now. My dad moved out after I returned, and he's been living with my brother. They've been working on the business together. My parents are going through counseling, trying to fix their marriage, but I don't ask about it. I don't want to know. What matters to me now is my future. My mother kept her promise, and I'm going to focus on my studies and make the most of this time. One day, when I can, I'll pay her back. But for now, I'm just going to live my life, free from the lies and the hurt they caused me. I'm going to make this work.